Hi friends, welcome to Time Python series. In this video, we're going to talk about how to use the pysftp Python module to interact with an SFTP server to perform actions like downloading files, uploading files, listing out the file names, etc. So since pysftp Python module is used to interact with an SFTP server, I have set up a local SFTP server using openssh. Here you can see in my services.msc, there is an openssh server running as a Windows background service. I have connected to my openssh server using winscp, and this is the root folder of this openssh server. Actually, I made my screenshots folder as the OpenSSH server root, and that's why you can see the same folder contents in my SFTP server root. This current SFTP server setup uses private key authentication for securing the SFTP connection. If you don't know how to set up an SFTP server in Windows, I have already created a blog post along with instructions on how to set up an SFTP server in Windows and how to set up password-based authentication and private key-based authentication in SFTP server. In that blog post, I also explained how to use winscp to connect to an SFTP server so that we can browse files in the SFTP server and perform actions like uploading and downloading. I have also made a video on how to set up a Windows-based SFTP server and how to use winscp to connect to that SFTP server. So if you don't know how to set up the SFTP server which I have created in this video, you can go back and see that video, and I will put the link of that video in the description. Alright, first let's try to install the pysftp Python module. For that, I'm going to open my command prompt and I'm going to run the command python -m pip install pysftp. pysftp Python module is installed in my Python environment now. So now we are ready to use pysftp Python module. So let's get started with coding and connect to a SFTP server using pysftp. I'm going to take a blank folder and I'm going to open this folder with VS Code. I'm going to create a new file. I'll just name it index.py. First, I will import the pysftp Python module. To connect to an SFTP server using pysftp, the connection parameters required are the host name, port, username, and the private key file path. So let's try to create variables for that now. SFTP host equal to localhost, SFTP port equal to 22. Generally, SFTP runs on port 22. Username equal to the operating system user, and the private key file path. I need to specify the path of the private key file in this variable, right? In my previous video, I've already created a private key file and I've saved that private key file in this username.ssh folder as id_rsa, and this private key is actually used for this SFTP server. So I'll just copy this private key file and paste this file in the same location of the script. So I'll open this folder and paste the private key file here. So now I have the private key file in the same folder, so I can just write /id_rsa. If you want to mention an absolute file path, you can also do that. So if I want to mention the absolute file path of the private key file, I'll just copy this folder path and paste the folder path here. So now this is the absolute folder path of the id_rsa file, which is the private key. And since I have black slashes, I'll just write r so that I don't need to write the double backslash. But for now, to make things simple, I'll just keep id_rsa because the file is present in the same folder as the Python script. Since we have our connection variables declared, let's try to connect to the SFTP server using pysftp. To connect to the SFTP server using pysftp, you need a SFTP connection object. So let's try to create that. I'll just write with pysftp dot connection, and inside the connection you have to give the parameters. So host equal to the SFTP host, and the port equal to the SFTP port, and username is equal to the SFTP username, and the private key file path is private_key equal to the private key file path. And let's alias this connection object as SFTP, and let's start the with block. So inside this with block, you will get an established pysftp connection as an object called SFTP. So inside this with block, you can do whatever with the SFTP connection. So since we are connected, let's try to create a simple print statement called print connected to SFTP server. Alright, so let's try to run this Python code. And when I run this code, I got an exception called no host key found. This happens when you don't have the SFTP known host file, or your SFTP host is not included in the known host file. So to mitigate this problem, we have to create connection objects. So let's try to go ahead and do that. I'll just write connection options equal to pysftp dot connection options, and here in the connection options, and in this connection options, set host keys none. So using these two lines, we are ignoring the known host file check while SFTP connection using pysftp. It is not recommended to skip known host check as it reduces security, but in our example we are just doing this to avoid the known host file check. Since I've created a connection option object, let's try to use that while creating the connection object. So here I'm going to give a new input called connection options, and I'm going to specify the new connection options object which I have created just now. Now since we have ignored the known host file check, let's try to run our code again. And here you can see connected to the SFTP server. So just with a single line of code, you can use pysftp to connect to your SFTP server. So if you are using password based authentication to connect to an SFTP server, instead of writing the private key input, you can write password input and write password equal to the password which you are using while creating the SFTP connection. Alright, since we have finished connecting to the SFTP server, let's try to change the working directory of the SFTP server. So here in WinSAP, you can see this is my SFTP server root folder, and I have a subfolder in the SFTP server, and this is called remote folder. So I want to change the root folder to this remote folder path. So I'm going to use the cwd function of SFTP connection so that I can change my working directory. So here I'm going to write sftp.cwd, and here I have to write the new folder path which is going to be the SFTP root for this connection object. So here I'm going to write /remote folder. So I'll just save it, and if I want to print the current working directory, I can just write sftp.pwd, which is print working directory, and here I'll just print this so that we can see what is the working directory. So before changing the working directory, let's try to print the present working directory so that we can see the change of the working directory by using the cwd command. So I'm printing the working directory before, changing the working directory, and printing the working directory again. So let's try to save it and run this, and here I got file not found error because I have misspelled the folder name. Here you can see the folder name is rmfoldr, but I wrote der. So let's try to correct that. I'll just change the folder name rem folder and then run this again. I'll just clear the output and run again. The first working directory was / and the next working directory was remote folder. Since we have used the sftp.change working directory to change the remote working folder. Alright, now let's try to find out what are the list of file names in a remote folder using the listdir command. So if you just use sftp.listdir, you will get the file names in a remote working directory. So let's try to use that now. I'm going to clear this code now. I'm going to write sftp.listdir. What listdir does is that it will return the list of file names in the root folder. So I'll just get into a variable called x, and I'll just print this variable. If you want to get the file contents inside a remote folder, you can write x equal to sftp.listdir, and in the input you can give the folder path. So if I write the folder path as the remote folder, I will get the file names inside the remote folder as opposed to the file names in the root folder. So I'll just print the x again. So let's try to save it and run this. Again I got the error because the folder name was wrong. So I'll just write remote folder. This is the correct folder name. I'll just save it and run this again. And here you can see this is the files inside the root folder, and this is the files inside the remote folder of the remote server. So here you can see inside the remote folder I got only 2 text files, and you can see the 2 text files here. And inside the root folder I got some 3 files and a single folder, and here you can see I got the 3 file names and a single folder name. So this way, using the listdir command, you can very easily get the list of file names and folder names inside a folder in a single line. Now let's talk about another function, which is listdir attributes, which gives you the file names and metadata of the file names also. So let's try to use that now. Instead of using listdir, I'm going to use listdir attributes, and I'm going to remove this below section. So now using this listdir attributes, I'll get the list of file name metadatas, and I'll just print it now. I'll just save it and run this, and here you can see I've got file name metadata objects, and in each object you can see the attributes, which is size, the ID of the user, the ID of the user group, the mode of the file, and the last access time, which is in a Unix epoch timestamp, and the last modified time. So these metadata of the file can be accessible using the listdir attributes. So instead of printing the objects, I can also print each metadata item by using a simple list compression. So I'll just write y for y in x, and instead of printing y, I'll just print a list of the items present in y dot file name, mode, size, and the modified time. So if I just run this, here you can see the file name, mode, the size in bytes, and the last modified time in Unix epoch timestamp. So now let's try to upload files into SFTP server directory using the putd and putr functions. So all these functions are similar, but now let's try to understand what is the difference between these functions. So if you use the sftp.put function, you can upload a single file into the remote server, and if you use the putd function, you can upload all the contents of a directory into the remote server directory. And if you use the put or functions, you can upload the folder contents into the remote folder, and all the subfolder of the local folder will also be copied into the remote folder. So let's try to use the sftp.put function. So in order to use that function, I'll just create a file so that I can upload into the remote folder. I'll just create a file, I'll just name it abcd.txt, and I'll write some text in this. So now I've got a file abcd.txt and I want to upload this to the remote server. So I'll just write sftp.put, and here first I have to mention the local path. The local path is abcd.txt, and you can even mention the absolute local path like C users and whatever, and then you can mention the remote path. If you don't mention the remote path, it will be stored in the root folder. And one more flag which I want to show you is the preserve m time equal to true. So what preserve m time equal to true does is it will preserve the modification time of the file in the remote folder also. So I'll just save it and run this, and if I refresh my remote folder, you can see I've got my abcd.txt, upload it into the remote folder. And if I want to upload abcd.txt into the another folder of the remote server, I can mention the remote folder path also. So if I want to upload this file to the remote folder, I can just write remote path, and here in the remote path I can write the full path of the file inside the remote server. So I'll just write remote folder /abcd.txt, or else you can write some other name. I'll just write xyz.txt. So I'll just save it, and now my abcd.txt will be uploaded into the remote server, but the path of the file will be remote folder /xyz.txt. So if I just run this, and if I open this remote folder, here you can see xyz.txt is uploaded here. So this way, using the put function, you can upload a single file into the remote folder. Alright, let's try to use the putd function. So putd function will upload the folder itself into the remote server. So here, for example, I'll just create a new folder. I'll write abc. I'll create some 3 files in this. So alright, I've got a new folder called abcd, and I've got 3 text files in this abc folder. So now let me try to transport these contents inside the abcd folder into my remote server SFTP folder. So for that, I have to write sftp.putd, which uploads the folder contents into the remote folder. So here I will give the local path, which is abc. You can even give the absolute folder path like C users abc, so on like that. Here I am saying preserve the modification time of the file contents, and I am giving the remote path equal to the folder path of the remote server. So if I want to copy it to the remote folder, I'll just write the remote folder. So now this file contents will be transported into this remote folder. I'll just save it and run this now. And here I don't know if it is particular to Windows, but I can't give relative path using putd functions. So I'll have to give an absolute folder path. So I'll just open this folder in Windows Explorer and copy this folder path and paste that folder path here. So now I will give my folder path, which is an absolute folder path, and now I'll run this function. And here you can see the files have been transported to the WinSCP server. So if I just open this remote folder inside the root folder and just refresh this, here you can see the new text files being transported into this remote folder. So using putd function, I have uploaded the folder contents into the remote server. If I don't mention the remote path, the file contents will be transported into the root folder. Putr function is also similar to putd, but if you have subfolders, even those subfolders will be transported to the remote server. Now let's try to get to know how to download files from SFTP server directory using get, getd, and getr. Get can be used to download a single SFTP server file, and getd can be used to download all the remote folder files into local folder, and getr is like a recursive download where you can download all the remote files into the local folder, and you'll get the subdirectories also from the remote server. So let's try to use sftp.get. I'll just write sftp.get. Here I have to give the remote path first. So I'll just write a remote file name, and then I can write preserve m time equal to true, so that I'll get the file modification time the same as the remote server. So in order to write the remote folder path, I'll just see the file name here. Here I have a file called abcd.txt in the remote folder, or else I'll just use this file name screenshot1.png. So I'll write screenshot1.png. So this is my remote file name, and I have to download this file into my local folder since I have not given any folder path. So I'll just run this here, and here I got the screenshot1.png file from the remote folder. You can even download a folder which is nested inside the remote folder. So if I want to download a file called remote folder /jhgj.txt, I can just write /remote folder /jhgj.txt. I'll just save it and run this now. Yeah, the remote folder name was wrong. Remote folder was this file name. So I'll just save it and run this again. And here you can see I got the jhgj.txt. So this way, using the sftp.get function, you can download a single remote file into your local folder. But if you want to change the file name while downloading, you can even specify the local folder path. So I'll just write local path equal to fgh.txt. So I'll just save it and run this. And here you can see I've got a new file called fgh.txt. I can even save in some absolute folder path, something like abc/plo.txt. So let's save it and run this. And inside the abc folder, I'll get a new file called plo.txt. So you can even download the single file and place it at a different location also using this local path input. Alright, now let's try to use the sftp.getd, where you can download the whole directory of the remote server and paste the contents into our local folder. So I'll just create a new local folder. I'll just name it uyt. So this is my new local folder, and I want to download the contents of this remote folder into this local folder called uyt. So get d and give the path of the remote folder. The remote folder path was the remote folder, and the local directory should be given. So I'll just write local dir uyt. So I'm downloading all the contents of the remote folder into a local directory called uyt, which is in the same folder as index.py. So let's try to run this file, and here you can see all the contents of the remote folder are downloaded into my local folder called uyt. So using getd, you can easily download all the remote folder files into local folder. The same way, getir is a recursive get, where you can even download all the subfolders of the remote folder also into your local folder. So let's try to use getir and run this here. Now you can see this difference. In getir, the whole remote folder along with the folder will be downloaded into a local path. That's why I got the remote folder also. The main folder also is been downloaded into uyt. But if I just use getd, only the contents of the remote folder will be downloaded into my local folder. So this is the difference between getir and getd. When using getir, the folder will be copied, and while using getd, the folder contents will be copied. And using getir, you can even download the subfolders of the remote folder. Alright, let's try to get the metadata of a remote file using the stat function. So if you call sftp.stat and give the file name path, you can get the statistics of the file, like what is the size of the file, what is the mode of the file, what is the timestamp of the recent access or modification time, or the user ID of the owner, group ID of the owner, something like that. So if I want to get the statistics of this file called xyz.txt in this remote folder, I have to write sftp.stat and I have to give the file path of the remote folder /xyz.txt, and let me try to save it in a variable called x equal to sftp.stat, and let's print x. So I'll just save it and run this. And here you can see the statistics is printed in a single line, but you can even access the statistics individually also by using something like x.st_m time. So it's like the modification time of the file. So let's save it and run this. It's a Unix epoch timestamp. You can convert it to a date time using this dd.datetime.from timestamp. So I'll just write it here. So to use dd, I have to use datetime. So I'll just write import datetime as dt. So I'm converting this Unix epoch timestamp into a Python datetime using dt.datetime.from timestamp. So let's save it and run this. And here you can see this is the file modification time, and I can see the file last access time using st_a time. So let's run this. So this is the last file access time, and I can get the file size in bytes. So I'll just remove this datetime thing and write x.st_size. So this is the size of the file in bytes. So if I just run this, it is 6 bytes. The file is 6 bytes. So this way, using the sftp.stat, you can get the statistics of a single remote folder file. The next thing is delete a remote folder. So if you use sftp.rmdir, you can delete a remote folder, but the remote folder should be empty. If the remote folder is not empty, you'll get an error. So let's try to use that function now. So I'll just write sftp.rmdir, that is remove directory, and here I'm going to write the remote folder path. So I'll just save it and run this. And here you got the IO error because the remote folder is not empty. So let me try to create a remote folder which is empty here. I'll just create a new folder fgd. So I got a new remote folder called fgd, and this is empty. So let me try to delete that folder now, fgd. So I'll just save it and run this file again, and here you can see my remote folder will be deleted. So deleting a remote folder is really straightforward in pysftp, but deleting a remote folder which has contents requires some exercise to be done on our end itself. So I've given a code to delete the remote folder with contents inside it. The code is really simple. So just find all the folder contents using the sftp.listdir, and you delete each file, and then you delete the main folder. And if you have subfolders, you do the nesting. So that's why we have done the recursive call. So if you just use this function, you can delete a remote folder also, which has contents inside it. Let's try to create a non-empty remote folder. So I'll just create a new directory here, new directory. Let me name the directory as ghy. So I've got a new remote directory. Let me create a new file here so that it's not empty. I'll just create a new file and name it something like this. So now I got a non-empty remote folder called ghy and it has one file in it. And if I run using the normal sftp.rmdir, it will throw an error. So we will use our function which we have created in this blog post. So let's copy this function and paste it in my code. So here I'm using the OS module to join the file path, and I'm using the stat module to know whether the file path is actually a folder or a file. Alright, now we got our function, and let's use that function to delete the non-empty remote folder. So here I'm going to write rm, the name of the function which we have just created, rm, and it takes the sftp object as the first argument, and the second argument is the path of the remote folder, and the path of the remote folder was ghy. So let me try to save it and run this now. Now let's try to see whether the folder exists or not. I'll just refresh it here, and you can see the remote folder which was not empty is also deleted by using the function called rm which you have created right now. So this way you can even remove non-empty remote server folders. Alright, let's get to know about some other important SFTP actions which we can do using pysftp Python module. sftp.makedirs is a really useful function where you can create a new folder in the SFTP server, and you can even create the nested folders if they are not present. So let's try to use this function now. So if you want to create a folder inside this SFTP server, something like abc/def, that means you need a nested folder but there is no folder called abc. Makedirs function will actually create the intermediate folders also for you. So let me try to use sftp.makedirs, and here I let the folder path as abc/def. That means I have to create a new folder called df inside a folder called abc, and if this abc folder is not present, even it will be created by the SFTP. So I'll just save it and run this, and let me try to refresh it here. Here you can see abc and df. So you are able to create nested folder, and intermediate folders, if they are not present, are also created by pysftp. And we already covered sftp.stat, and if you use the st_size, you can get the size of the remote file in bytes. And sftp.rename is also a very useful function where you can rename a remote file or folder. So let's try to use it now. I have a file called abcd.txt. Let's try to rename it to xyz.txt. So you just write sftp.rename abcd.txt. This is the original file name. If it's present in a folder, you can write folder1/abcd.txt, something like that. And then you write the rename file name. So I can write xyz.txt. So I'm renaming the abcd.txt to xyz.txt. I'll just save it and run this. And I'll go to the remote server. I'll just refresh it. And here you can see I've renamed it to xyz.txt. The next important thing is sftp.remove. You can remove a single SFTP file using the sftp.remove function. So let's try to use it now. I've got a file called xyz.txt, and if I want to remove this file, I can just write sftp.remove, and I'll write xyz.txt. I'll just save it and run this. And if I go to this remote server and refresh, you can see I don't have xyz.txt. And that's it, guys. That was all about using pysftp Python module to perform some important actions on an SFTP remote server using your Python code. I have created a blog post on using pysftp Python module for SFTP server interaction. I have also given you all the sample codes so that you can copy paste and practice it in your own computer. So be sure to check out the link of this blog post in the description of this video. In the references section, I have given the link of the pysftp cookbook, which is a really great resource to learn pysftp very fast. Here they have given sample codes, and you can learn each function using a sample code. For example, if I'm using the sftp.get, here you can see sftp.get, and he's telling how this function can be used. So this cookbook is really useful for you to understand each function of the pysftp module. And if you don't find your required function in the pysftp cookbook, you go to the home and click on the API tab, and here you can see all the functions will be given along with the parameters description. And one more thing I want to highlight here is pysftp is just a wrapper around the paramiko Python module, which actually implements the SFTP client. So this is a link for the paramiko docs. Please leave your valuable feedback or any questions in the comment section. Hope you like this video, guys. Thank you for watching.